Let me ask you a question. In Super Mario Bros., how do you know you're the good guy? You might think that's a question with a lot of obvious answers, but really think about it. If you just fired up the game and started playing, how would you know? The game at no point affirms your role as the hero, you're just some Italian-American guy crushing turtles. Now, I will concede that the obvious answers are probably sufficient here. Traditionally, the player in a game is put in the role of the hero, and the hero's job is to do good things. So Mario, by virtue of player control, is the good guy. Also, you're a guy who's saving a princess from a reptile that breathes fire. All of the storytelling traditions we draw upon would say that this guy is the good guy. And frankly, there's no need for the game to make it explicit with a number. Like, there isn't an evil playthrough of a Mario game because he just is the hero, and no one wants a game where a possible evolving narrative is Mario and Bowser are fighting over the power to wield political control over the Mushroom Kingdom with Princess Peach as a puppet monarch. No one wants that, and no one wants all of that to be happening because Mario is being judged by how paragon or renegade he is. Well, maybe I kind of want that because I think it'd be very funny. But Super Mario Bros. As presented doesn't need a morality system. It's interesting that morality systems are implemented in a lot of different ways, in different settings, with different implications about the characters, and all of these games run into similar problems, including the game that this video is kind of a spin-off from. I was working on another script, and I got on a pretty extensive rant in the current version of it, and so I thought it'd be easier to just have this to point to instead of just going on a massive tangent in that video. And that game was the Mass Effect trilogy, and it's about a specific character. I'll throw up an obligatory Who's That Pokemon screen here, feel free to guess in the comments. Basically, I can't finish that script until I do this video. My brain isn't letting me, so this is happening. I'll be referring to that unreleased video occasionally, and I think this context will help explain why I'm talking about the specific games I am in this video, because the implementation of explicit morality in video games has been a thing for a long time, but my peak gaming years, at least in terms of time I had to play games, were dominated by the games that tried to insist that my choices mattered. Games that often touted their moral complexity and that the way my player characters engaged with the world would contribute to the ebbs and flows of how the story plays out. And actually, in that video that's yet to be released, I think I found a rare example of that actually being the case, despite the restrictions the model of morality those games choose impose upon it. I was thinking about all of this, and the gears started turning. There are some very interesting requirements of a game that has a morality system that's explicit and more complicated than the most basic type of morality in video games, because the characters in these games, by virtue of the freedom given to the players, have to be able to contain multitudes, and a lot of contradictory choices have to be possible in a way that doesn't feel jarring. These requirements are also in their own way limiting, and I think these limitations and shortcomings are part of the reason why we don't see this as much as we used to. There are still Star Wars games, even ones that have come out recently, and feature Jedi or Force users, but we're well removed from the days of the extremely loud "you have done a dark side action" music partially deafening you and KOTOR. The other reason I think we moved away from this is, as we'll see, that these systems, if combined with the promise of choices mattering, can often yield unsatisfying results. Not always, and the dissatisfaction people express about them isn't always justified, and it's possible, even if there are shortcomings and limitations, to tell interesting stories in games that have this element in them. Where does this element come from? It's a consequence of games becoming more narrative. One of the cool things about video games is they're an interactive medium. To some extent, in every game, you can choose how to proceed. Think of the alternative paths available to you in Sonic games. Think of games that have optional stealth mechanics. Believe me, they're optional. Think of games that don't punish you for ignoring enemies. There's lots of ways to allow the player to choose, but when you impose a narrative that's more complex than a chubby Italian guy saves a princess, you're confronted with the prospect of imposition. Something that stands out in games that have more cinematic elements or are adaptations of cinematic settings is the sensation that there's a dissonance between being able to play how you want within the confines of the experience that the game comes in and being railroaded. It's actually one of these challenges I have to deal with when I run a D&D game. I come into a session with a plan, usually, and I have things that are prepared. But I try to make the game as much of a open sandbox as possible, which is how you end up with some of the spectacular nonsense that goes on in those D&D sessions I do on the channel sometimes. You should check those out. In video games though, it's a natural next step. You end up with games that are more narrative, that begin to resemble the non-interactive media a lot of us consume. And what could be better than giving someone a little control over the course of the narrative and giving that to the player? And often the most obvious contrast to draw is one between good and evil, which brings us to the first of the models of morality I want to talk about. The way we're going to talk about different models is going to be through the power of maths, and I understand if you don't like it, but trust me, this is going somewhere, and it's going to be the easiest way to explain it for me. We will use some virtual graph paper and start with a point and a companion point that's not connected to it. In this system, we have no freedom of movement. The 2 points are fixed, and we can label them whatever we want. We could call them good, evil, light side, dark side, paragon, renegade, pacifist, violent, whatever directly opposed values you want to call them. Because we have no freedom to move, this is a system I would describe as zero-dimensional. Now, you could also call it binary. You know, it's either on or off, 1 or 0, but there is no in-between between these 2 points. They are, in mathematical terms, discrete, distinct and separate. This is representative of the simplest model of morality in video games. You get to a point and you are allowed to make a choice, or sometimes a series of choices, that changes the course of the narrative. You can place this at any point. You can do it at the beginning, in the middle, or the end. But for our purposes, we're mostly talking about the end. You go through a narrative, you reach the point, and you make a decision that you can't take back because these 2 positions are discrete and mutually exclusive. You can't be good and evil. You can't be on and off. Some of you might recognize this as the fundamental building block of a lot of visual novels. Some of you might even see where it's inevitably leading to already. But despite being simple and despite zero-dimensional sounding like an insult, this has its place. Sometimes simpler is better and is more suitable for the kind of story and setting you're playing in. Some of the most well-received games have used this model. I think of the Jedi Knight series of games, where it's possible, in some of those games, to get a dark side ending, as well as a light side one. Arguably, those are some of the best Star Wars games, and there wasn't any need for an especially complicated morality system to generate 2 potentially satisfying outcomes. The other Star Wars game that comes to mind, that's a bit more modern, is The Force Unleashed, where the ending you get is determined by the only plot significant choice you're given right at the end. Does your Starkiller succumb to his desire for revenge and finish off Darth Vader, or does he confront the Emperor in order to save the fledgling rebellion? Both endings and both actions feel consistent with the story that's told throughout the game. Starkiller is, by the sum of his experiences, a conflicted person. It's entirely believable that he would regress to the dark side and end up as Vader 2.0. It's also believable that he'd put his life on the line for people whose cause he came to believe in. Also, if adapting a movie setting into a video game is meant to give you a sense that you're playing the movies, then this is really the best way to represent the morality of Star Wars as presented in the films, lest we forget that You can be the ultimate symbol of oppression and evil, but if you have a last second change of heart because your son is getting zapped to death on the floor, you get to come back as Hayden Christensen. It was precisely as much of a decision as Starkillers that swung Vader all the way back to the light side. Let's return to our two dots. What if we connected these lines together so that we could move between good and evil, or whatever we choose to label this as? In this model, we have one axis along which we have freedom of movement, which makes this a one-dimensional system. In this model, as we progress through a story, we are presented with a series of choices, and the sum total of our actions gives us a position in relation to these 2 points. If we choose to act with immense kindness, we'll move towards good. If we act like a dick, we move towards evil. It's simple, it's easy to understand, it's compatible with a lot of different genres of games, and again, it sounds insulting, but it can be used very effectively. You'll see this kind of morality in a game like Black and White, where you're a god and you can be a good god or a bad god, though fundamentally that game is an RTS. It's not a role-playing game. You can even see it in 4X games. I remember Galactic Civilizations 2 had a morality system where you'd be presented with dilemmas, and the way you responded to them would impact the character of your interstellar society. Most notably, this model was particularly associated with RPG games. To return to the Star Wars galaxy, and another one of the best regarded games set there, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic was probably the first game I remember playing that did this, that had an explicit meter by your character measuring how light side or dark side they were. I think this model works best in an RPG where the player is led to a set of endings, and usually it's left to players to decide whether they're going to be, coherent or not. That might remind you of the zero-dimensional model, and we'll get there because this is an important point. But it's interesting in KOTOR that you can be good all the way up to a certain point, or evil all the way up to that certain point, then flip, which is a natural consequence of seeking to empower the player. There's also an argument to be made, and I will make it a little here, that approval and reputation mechanics also represent 1D morality systems. Reputation is in a lot of games. Freelancer, if anyone remembers that game, has a reputation mechanic. More recently, Baldur's Gate 3 leans heavily on party approval. What you do here is you take your line and you label it differently. Approve, disapprove. Love, hate. Romanceable, hate fuckable. Whatever floats your boat. And you make them all parallel lines. Companion and faction opinions may overlap and align, so if you tend to have a good relationship with one character or faction, it likely means you have a good relationship with another. But these are measured independently because they are independent, since there is an interesting limitation that can occur here, which is that this model of morality often requires the faction or companion to witness you either aligning with their morals and position in the world or violating them. An interesting example of this is in Dragon Age Origins. On a particular questline, you're tasked with recovering a portion of the ashes of a prophet. You can choose to defile their ashes in exchange for dragon powers. If you do this in front of a specific companion, in this case Liliana, she'll attack you. If you don't do it in front of her, she'll ask you about it, and you can lie and get away with it, even though your companions who were with you saw you do it. It's an odd one, and I guess they kind of didn't think it through perfectly, but Liliana has a set of principles of her own, not purely good, I would say, but it's obvious which side of that divide she sits on overall in that setting, which is how this is an example of morality. The characters and factions in a given setting have principles, morals, and political concerns of their own. It's not objective like the Force in Star Wars is supposed to be, or Fallout's karma system, or how your hand looks in Black and White 2, since companions and factions, at least if they're fleshed out to a decent degree, will have their approval or disapproval of you determined by their position in the setting and relationship with other relevant parties. So despite multiple axes being in play here, even if you have multiple factions and companions, this remains a one-dimensional system, even though it's one that can present a lot more shades of grey than you might otherwise get. What if we take our line and draw a line for it? Some of you will immediately recognise this and be terrified beyond imagining, because welcome to the worst maths lessons of your life, because it's a Cartesian plane. What these would represent is two independently measured axes of morality. Again, we can apply whatever labels we like here. In cases where you can move freely in this plane in all directions, you tend to have the two axes be totally independent of each other, but with opposite extremes at either end. This reminds me of a game I've never played myself, but I did watch someone play it for a lot of time, and it's Dishonored, which has two axes labeled stealth, assault, and lethal, non-lethal, respectively. And in Dishonored, at least this is what I'm getting from the wiki, you can move freely in this plane, increase and reduce chaos respectively. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this because I've not played the game and I don't particularly find myself drawn to it given my own difficulties with stealth mechanics. I'm just going to be honest about that. But there is another game I think I can talk about and that this applies to in an interesting way. And it's the one that caused all of this to happen, Mass Effect. Mass Effect takes the one-dimensional system with two opposing philosophies, Paragon and Renegade, which are vaguely aligned to good and evil, though this is more complicated than that since it also contains a lawful versus chaotic element, to borrow a D&Dism, and makes them independent axes despite the fact that on the surface they should be mutually exclusive. You can only go up or maintain your Paragon or Renegade points. No amount of good deeds can erase the time you mercilessly killed a prisoner. No amount of evil can erase the time you spared as many people as possible on a difficult mission. In that script I haven't recorded yet, at least the version as it stands, I described this as Stannis Baratheon morality. A good act does not wash out the bad, nor the bad the good, is how Mass Effect operates its morality system. And while I think this is one of the contributing factors to how badly the ending of Mass Effect 3 was received, and that it might not have been the right system, it does reflect something credible about a character like Commander Shepard, which is that throughout the game, it's made clear that Shepard is famous and that word travels. If you hear about a guy who goes around killing prisoners of war to make a point, and he shows up armed, ready to fight you, you might not want any of that and just let them pass. Similarly, if you hear about a guy who both makes deals to show mercy and keeps their word, you might be willing to make a deal with them. These can both be true, and your character indulging in these instincts contributes to them accumulating these points. It's interesting because violence generally aligns with Renegade, and pacifism, or at least a rhetorical commitment to pacifism, aligns more with Paragon. Accumulating both can allow you to skip certain combat encounters and smooth over certain obstacles that would otherwise be very annoying. And you can get there either by being War Crime Shepard or Heroic Self-Sacrifice Shepard, which, yes, are essentially the two extremes of the character. In Mass Effect, you are the sum total of your actions and your impact on the galaxy, and while it's simple, all they've done is separately track good and evil actions. And it does have a profound truth to it. And to the extent that there's anything interesting about Shepard, and yes, we'll be talking about how much of a boring person they are because it lives rent-free in my head, it comes out in these Paragon and Renegade dialogue choices. Your choices as the player. With all this, we might want to imagine what a 3D morality system looks like. And this is where I have to confess a limitation in my personal knowledge and experience. If you know of a game with explicit morality that's three-dimensional in the way that I would describe it, please let me know. My proofreader did bring up Fable, which was a game I watched a friend play more than one I played myself, but we can see how such a system might take shape just based on what's already been said. We might look at a game like Fallout New Vegas, where you have both the karma system, which is our sort of conventional 1D system, and a reputation system among the factions and companions that have their own morality as a severely flattened swing towards a 3D outcome using 1D components. It's like trying to create a projection of 3D. Now, the issue here is that not all of these are independent from each other. Certain characters will not tolerate you cooperating with the Legion, for example. But that's about the maximum depth of it. In a way, the companion approval-disapproval system in New Vegas is itself a 0D system, and the same could be said for KOTOR 2, though KOTOR 2 lacks any kind of morality beyond your position in relation to the Force and influence over companions in that game, which is used to move those characters to align with you morally. No matter how many dimensions we choose to give a theoretical morality system for a game, there are certain consequences of choosing to measure morality in an explicit and mechanical way. Limitations that are applied and challenges to your ability to make a game satisfying. For me, there are 3 problems I really want to focus on because they bother me in particular, but these are by no means the only issues, so if you have other ones, good for you. But we're going to get into my personal top 3 problems. Speaking from personal experience and from talking to friends, the sense I get is that people don't tend to go for an evil playthrough the first time they play. Or really at all sometimes. I'm pretty sure there was some kind of article or paper on this, but I've long since lost it. So understand I could be talking shite here, and everyone always does evil playthroughs first. I just don't. It's just not what I know, right? Regardless, if you have alternative branching pathways divided by morality, how do you make evil something people want to do? Beyond appealing to the completionist in some people, you have to tempt people to play against the default way that people would expect a player character to behave in a story. It's often the case with evil playthroughs that because it's not the default expectation, these branches are not as well written as the default sort of good ones. Not always, of course, but there's a type of evil that's common in video games, and it's not a type of evil that's able to fit into compelling narratives as easily as sort of conventional heroism. Also, a lot of evil in video games is just anti-narrative. It's a way to skip over something, usually by harming or insulting someone. If we think back to the joke example I used at the start of the video, which was to kind of ask the question, what if Super Mario Bros. Had a morality system? That would yield an absurdly cartoonish and ridiculous kind of evil playthrough, partially because it's a game aimed at children, primarily. God, that's just upset someone in their early 40s, hasn't it? My point isn't that absurd evil isn't appropriate. Evil is often very over the top and ridiculous. It can also be boring. Like, no one wants to play a game where they're Keir Starmer, but in a game where you have a choice, it does tend to be the case that heroism, being a paragon, whatever you like to call it, has a lot more compelling options to it. Especially because there's this tendency in Choices Matter games to make your choices basically run-of-the-mill conventional heroism or literally driving an intelligent species to extinction. And yes, I'm talking about the Rachni in Mass Effect, and it's absurd that anyone objects to you releasing the Rachni with the information you get. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. This range of options does tend to push you away from evil, because when you're good, you're good. When you're evil in a lot of these games, you could just be a bit of a dick, but you could also be the God Emperor of Dune. In abstract, these aren't equal and opposite ranges, and they require quite different execution. In some cases, the evil option has the same character as a politician's logic. we must have an evil option, this is evil, therefore this is the option we must have, which is not a great process through which to create compelling and interesting evil that fits into a narrative instead of destroying it. How do games try to solve this problem? One obvious method is just playing to people's curiosity. If a game is pitched as one where every decision or a lot of decisions potentially have a big impact, you might just want to see what happens. Now, this is usually something that's done in a replay of a game rather than a first playthrough. But I would argue that it's arbitrary to care about what order people do these playthroughs in, even though I did just talk about it. But it's kind of arbitrary. Replayability and different potential outcomes because your choices actually have weight is appealing. I know some of you watching have absolutely done a Caesar's Legion run in New Vegas to see what happens, and that's okay. I'm not judging you. This, incidentally, is why it's taking until this year for me to play Mass Effect 3 for the second time. What incentive is there to replay a game where the main distinction at play is what color ending I get? But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. How might a game lure you into, if not an evil playthrough, then at least a little bit of indulging in evil? The obvious thing to do would be to lean into an understanding of evil as not stronger, but easier. Indulging in evil may be the path of least resistance. It might be easier to just pin an action on a false culprit instead of actually putting in the effort to solve something properly. Alternatively, there might be a payoff. You could get perhaps a short-term advantage, just making something up here, but if you were to encounter a trade caravan being harassed by bandits, the bandits might offer you a share of the spoils if you joined them, and they don't look well armed, so who would even have to know that you did this? Plus you could use their supplies, so you join them. This withers a little in multiple playthroughs because you might come to learn that saving the merchant leads to something better later. A discount on items, access to special items, that kind of thing. If you're playing in a, for want of a better term, honest way, this could be an effective way to lure you into indulging in a bit of evil. This can also work with more options. I mentioned Galactic Civilizations 2. In that game, you get 3 options, creatively called good, evil, neutral, which usually boils down to short-term loss and long-term payoff versus short-term gain and long-term loss, with a middle option for cowards, which makes the fact that the human faction in that game is neutral kind of telling and funny. There's no reason why you couldn't increase the resolution of this, but despite the game being a bit of a spreadsheet simulator at times, I doubt people want to scroll through a ton of potential actions there. If you're asking me what I did, I usually went neutral, which in itself is a flaw of that particular system, but we're deviating from the point a little bit here. Another way you can convince a player to take the evil path is if you make it really satisfying. I quite like the renegade trigger actions in Mass Effects 2 and 3. That doesn't lock you into anything consequential, but it can get you used to being kind of an asshole. One example I quite like that does have consequences is Dragon Age Origins, which doesn't explicitly have an evil path, or at least it's not described that way, but it's kind of obvious that there are choices that in the setting aren't good. Maybe this is controversial, but I think killing Loghain, who is the main human antagonist of the game, is an evil choice. Yet it's one that aligns with a character, Alistair, who usually only approves of actions I would characterize as plainly good. He's a kind of simple, straightforwardly typical lawful good paladin type. You can even let Alistair execute Loghain himself, which is really interesting. Vengeance is a really powerful motivator, but it's also unambiguously bad in most media. This example is actually even more satisfying as the human noble origin, because Loghain is the one who elevated and supported Al-Hau, who kills your family at the start of your story. You don't get a choice in how to deal with him. He dies no matter what, but what to do with Loghain is genuinely kind of complicated, yet I've never chosen to let him live. It's obviously the right choice to be merciful and to use a person who clearly has talents that are an asset. It appeals to the parts of us that love a redemption arc. But it's not that simple, because this guy may not have ruined everything, because the forces you're dealing with are too big for that to be the case, but he's made everything much harder than it needs to be. Staying in Dragon Age Origins, there's another interesting choice that game presents, which is in the Urn of Sacred Ashes questline. At the later stages of this plotline, you are given a choice to defile the ashes of a prophet in the setting in order to gain access to a specialization for the warrior class. Alternatively, you can choose to not do this and only take what you need to complete the quest and go home. There's something interesting about this, which is that once you unlock the class specialization, you don't have to do it again in future playthroughs of the game. So on replays, this isn't as tempting. And I'll tell you, on my first playthrough, I was kind of really tempted. I didn't do it because I had a party member who would likely turn on me the second I did it, but it was sorely tempting. Access to unique bonuses, powers, classes that can serve as a pull factor into evil playthroughs. Which does bring us to probably the best recent storyline that's trying to pull you into evil. Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't have an explicit good-evil or chaotic lawful measurement of your character. You live and die by your companion's approval, and yet there are some choices that are clearly more evil than others. There is a playthrough you can do that is explicitly pulling you towards evil throughout, and that's the Dark Urge playthrough, which optionally, and sometimes not so optionally, pushes your character to just give into some inherent part of themselves that drives them to do awful acts of violence. It captures this element of D&D where you can play an evil campaign, and that's not always desirable or run especially well even with preparation. It's still interesting that they made almost an entirely separate campaign for you to play, where you can not only indulge in evil as you can in any playthrough, but you are inherently either resisting or indulging this part of yourself, and it twists and turns you as the player a little bit. At least that's what it's going for, even if the execution is not, strictly speaking, doing enough of that. Even though it's been a while since I've played the game, let alone done a Dark Urge playthrough, the clear memory I have is that they actually tried to put effort into a storyline where being evil is going to be a recurring issue for your character. Putting that effort in to make the evil options feel equivalent to the good options, as opposed to pure cartoonish villainy, though I will acknowledge that some of the Dark Urge's actions do veer into that, but the essence of that playthrough that shines through is the inner conflict of trying to resist your nature as a Baalspawn, which, by the way, we've had enough Baalspawn in Baldur's Gate. Can we put a stop to the Baalspawn until we figure out what's going on? One last way you could do this, and this isn't an exhaustive list, is good old-fashioned alternative endings. Look, it's simple and it's really applicable to the cases where your ending boils down to a limited set of choices, but a really good evil ending can be so much fun. It's interesting to think of a character who has all the hallmarks of a hero just succumbing and being like that. I think this isn't done perfectly all the time, or really at all a lot of the time. Mass Effect 3 kind of stands out as especially bad, but there's a part of me that looks at interactive media and wonders, what if I did this other thing? And that's connected to the Dark Urge in Baldur's Gate 3 because it's interesting to deliberately create an alternative starting point that practically encourages you to go down the evil path and to have that path be as fleshed out as the good, in quotes, because you can be bad, obviously, in the default things, option. As far as problems go, this can and has been solved to an extent, but the fundamental component often missing is compelling evil. Something that isn't as cartoonish as Dr. Eggman blowing up half the moon. It can be done, and there are factors that prevent this in games that explicitly measure morality, Mainly that often the evil or renegade or low karma side of the equation is so obviously awful that it feels ridiculous even in the context of a video game. I want to shift gears a little and finally talk about something that's been on my mind for a long time. Why is Commander Shepard in Mass Effect like that? Stilted, awkward, veers wildly from way too expressive to totally flat. Now I acknowledge there's a difference between the ways Fem Shep and Male Shep are played by their respective voice actors, and this is less of a problem in one case, but the characters themselves are not super interesting and aren't really played in an interesting way. The turns of phrase may be good, and there are definitely a few lines that are delivered really well and have a great sense of timing, but Commander Shepard is truly a boring bastard. They just are. Just think about this. Is there any point during the Mass Effect trilogy where Commander Shepard is the most interesting person in the room? This is not exclusive to Mass Effect, and while it's tempting to put this down to there being a voiced protagonist, it's not just that. In games of this kind with silent protagonists and options for what they have to say, they don't always have a lot of character in them. They may be related to your character's traits, but they're not in and of themselves super interesting. The advantage written speech has is that it has to be concise and there isn't a performance that mediates it. When I played KOTOR, the protagonist's voice and delivery were entirely up to my imagination. So maybe the play here is to return to silent protagonists. I don't know. Regardless, in games with morality systems, especially RPGs, the interesting thing is never your character. If you're lucky and you're playing a good one, it's usually your companions, the plot that drives you forward and the world you're inhabiting that hooks you. Very few people are sticking with these games because the player character is just so fascinating. Usually, they're a relatively bland and blank slate that bumbles through the world at your pace. There's a reason for this, and it's because in any morality system that's one-dimensional or more complicated, you need to have room for your character to be incoherent. Think about this. What is the easiest way to represent a character that can veer from acts of great kindness to horrible things? And the answer is to make them have as little pre-existing character as possible. I'm dunking on Commander Shepard a lot, but they're a great example. They can veer from really sensitive and compassionate to committing genocide in almost sequential choices. And it does kind of work, both because the games provide consequences for incoherence. For example, betraying Rex in Mass Effect 3 results in him trying to kill you. It also works because this incoherence is something everyone does. I do it. You do it. That guy down the pub definitely does it. Now, hopefully, we're not going to the extremes on the scale of these characters. Our incoherences are often less impactful because we're not the protagonist of reality. There are people who hold truly bizarre beliefs to hold together, and that gives this potential for incoherence. Maybe realism isn't the right word, but a familiarity. Mass Effect is kind of the exception to the rule where incoherence can incur some consequences. Usually the player is free to just do as they wish because your quests are not interconnected over the course of a trilogy of games, and usually they're separated by quite significant distances. So we can overlook this. And there isn't necessarily a need for incoherence to be punished or remarked upon for things to feel like they make sense. A character who indulges in cruelty in one place and time might be a truly heroic and kind figure in another, and it can make sense. Maybe the path of least resistance in one place is just so much easier if it's evil that you'd kind of be a fool not to. The other reason this works is if you have as little characterization as possible, it's hard to damage a character with your writing. If they don't have strong convictions or beliefs or personality, then the player can be in control of that expression in a usually superficial in the end, more substantial way. It also just opens up options for how far your character can go, which is why Commander Shepard is like that. No matter how much affection we may have for specific moments of that character that sneak through, a great counterexample and an example that works in its own way is The Witcher 3. Geralt of Rivia is an established character with an established morality that he operates within. In that game, you do make choices, and those choices operate within that morality, but at no point are you given the impression that Geralt is some supreme character who on his own pushes the destiny of the entire world. It's kind of meant to be the opposite of that, but he's more important than a guy working on a farm, but he's not the protagonist of the kind of game we're talking about. The Witcher 3 doesn't have an explicit morality system that impacts gameplay. We might project morality onto those choices, but at no point do we noticeably step outside of the established character. This isn't how the protagonists of games with morality systems are usually written. The aforementioned need to allow for incoherence is also tied to one of the key promises of these games, that the player is supreme, that they and the character they play are such a substantial figure that they can alter the course of history on their own. And it's rather difficult to produce this sensation with a character with an established backstory that's relevant to their moral choices throughout the game. This is why your typical protagonist of this game is either a boring soldier, just some guy, an amnesiac, someone who's so traumatized they've buried any character they may have had or are very young. These are characters who can convincingly be boring enough to contain multitudes. In fact, the more complicated the morality of the setting, the more boring the protagonist must become to facilitate the sensation of being in control, of your choices mattering, which does neatly bring us to the final problem that I want to talk about, which is that all of this doesn't really matter in a lot of these games because all of the complexity inevitably collapses. This has been the looming elephant in the room from the moment I started describing the different models of morality. Video games, for all their interactivity, are finite experiences, and the limits of it are defined not only by the vision of the people who work on the game, but on the fact that making a video game, even one that seeks to empower a player, is something worked on by people, and inevitably that has to come to an end at some point. What this means, in practical terms, is no matter how many divergent stories and consequences there may be for the choices that a player makes in a game that supposedly empowers and judges them through a morality system, the experiences of every player must eventually converge in some fashion. This is true of every game that has a choice element, whether it's merely in how you play, to go back to the Super Mario example, or it's in significant choices. This convergence doesn't have to pull you back to the same ending. It can be the case that certain combinations lead to different endings, but an ending is inevitably where you end up, and the story must end, and the sum of your actions more often than not comes out to not very much. And it's very contradictory in some of these games. A lot of these games spend an awful lot of time insisting, both mechanically and narratively, that you are the most important person in this narrative. And in some cases, in human history. I'm not joking. That is the heavy implication in at least one of the examples I've mentioned. So it creates a dissonance when you actually stop and look at what the ending sequences for a lot of these games are. To take us on a whirlwind tour, what do the Battle of the Starforge in KOTOR, the sequence to get to the Crucible in Mass Effect 3, and the Battle of Denerim in Dragon Age Origins have in common, aside from being made by the same studio? It's that nothing you do really matters in any significant way once you reach those points. They more or less play out the same no matter what you've done. Sure, you get different flavors of enemies and allies, and yes, you may not get access to certain endings, but ultimately, these sequences are not meaningfully changed by what you did. You fight through the enemies, you confront the final boss, and you get the ending you're assigned by one, maybe two critical choices. Because of the need for narrative convergence, what you have is what I'd call model collapse. The course of a lot of games of this type's finale is fixed, and you don't really have any direct control over how it plays out. Yes, in Dragon Age Origins, there's a very particular choice that can allow the Warden to survive killing the Archdemon, but for the most part, every player's Battle of Denerim plays out pretty much the same. Really, all of Dragon Age Origins boils down to a 0D model from earlier. Your actions may change your particular way to worm out of the inevitable death, but fundamentally on a structural level, it's a distinction that lacks a difference. Some games make this even more explicit. Mass Effect 3's notorious ending just presents you with the exact 0D model I talked about earlier. All of those choices, all of that heartache, all of that investment, and it boils down to 3 choices or a rejection of the choice in the updated ending. All of this has the potential to feel unsatisfying, and not to defend the Mass Effect 3 ending, crash outs, which in hindsight were a bit much, but I think the proof is there that this can be received poorly. Even if the people reacting poorly may not be proportionate about it, the fact is that having the game tell you how important you are, being told how much your choices matter, and then it's just 3 choices that, once again, boil down to slightly different colors for the ending, even if it's an inevitability that experiences have to converge to some extent, it still kind of leaves a sour taste. This is the fundamental limitation of any finite experience. Boundaries will exist, and those boundaries may not be satisfying. When you combine this with the model collapse, and you actually look at the way these different pathways are constructed, you realize what the fundamental building block is here, and how that creates this problem. The building block is that 0D model. Every choice we make in every quest, who we side with in an encounter, whether we help a character, all of it is just the 0D model being used in a way to create a sensation of complexity. There may be some middle ground that makes it a bit more complicated than just straight up being good or evil. We might indulge in a mix, but the ultimate course tends to be binary. This being the fundamental unit is the limitation and means as players, we can't really have control in the way that's promised by these games. Either our choices have to be so distant as to be left in our wake and irrelevant by the end, or they have to be rendered pointless by a bigger choice, and in the end that produces potentially unsatisfying outcomes. That's not to say that there aren't games with morality systems that don't stick the landing. Often those are ones that emphasize the distance and that have simpler models, or make it abundantly clear that there's some bigger plot at work, and all of this stuff you're doing is just a warm-up for the real choice that decides where you end up. That's where I am, resenting the finite nature of everything and wondering whether any of this can really be made to work. As I thought about this, something that struck me was how much explicit morality in the form of Paragon versus Renegade or Darkside versus Lightside has fallen out of fashion. It feels like a relic of a particular time, and what's replaced it is usually a companion approval-based system, where there are still obviously good and evil choices, but it becomes about how those characters we travel with feel rather than some nebulous judgment of the universe. The other alternative is to have a character who actually has a personality and established characterization, which I would say doesn't mean the stories are necessarily better, but more likely to satisfy. Even if they try to give you choices within that character's morality, you can still do a lot with it. And yeah, it can deliver experiences that are more timeless. It is genuinely a little difficult to go back to a game like Mass Effect, as I've been doing, even with a remaster. And part of it is because these morality systems feel like an encumbrance at times because of the things we've talked about earlier. To step into the speculation zone for a second, another part of me wonders if the shift towards companion opinion, towards player characters with a fixed moral universe, is because they offer the sensation of complexity without the risks of trying to make a player feel like they're a god. You can also write more interesting conflicts, create drama that feels organic, and not like, oh, you've reached this number, guess it's time to deal with this character's nonsense now. You can have the player character credibly clash with their own side. The other speculation I'd make is that I wonder if this shift has happened because developers saw what happened when this model broke down in a way where everything went wrong at once. As much as journalists like to say that online isn't real life, and I've spoken at length in other videos about my views on that particular sort of turn of phrase, the fact is that the recipients of ire are people. A screen doesn't protect you from how your own mind reacts to seeing someone call something you made terrible. A sensation that I'm all too familiar with. So maybe that's the source of my sympathy here. To do one final drive-by on Mass Effect, a series I love, by the way, I can't help but think back to the indoctrination theory stuff. If you don't know what that is, consider yourself blessed. But that whole thing was already kind of an embarrassment and was a massive community-wide coping session. It was incredible, but I also understand why people who make games might not want to experience, indoctrination theory as farce. Which is why I think there does seem to be this discarding of the notion that the player characters in these games are absolute autocrats over the moral course of the universe. It has both yielded better outcomes recently and saves you a bunch of hassle. So why wouldn't you do this? Then the speculation in my head becomes, could a return to these explicit morality systems work? And this is where I have to confess to another gap in my knowledge. So please do tell me if something like this exists that has been made recently. Because, one way you could get over this is by having a player character who is subjected to the moral judgment of the universe in a mechanical way, but is ultimately extremely powerless or a victim of events. Perhaps your choice is just pick the ending for you. You don't get the big final choice. You're either a hero or you're the bad guy or something in between, and that's it. No redemption because you press the button at the end. I'm not sure how you would sort of marry all of these concepts in a satisfying way necessarily, even though I'm sure it would produce an interesting outcome. Maybe it can't fix the fundamental problems, but I'd like to see it. And again, if it exists, tell me, and I'll probably play it eventually. The alternative is to simplify. The less complexity, the less power you afford to a player, the more likely you are to produce a morality system that doesn't obviously highlight the limitations of the medium. That's really it. As much as I think these systems could have their place in a game, they do kind of have the character of an antique. They're nice to look at, but it wouldn't be the first thing that I look for in terms of practical purposes. Which is sad. These games with morality systems were a big part of growing up for me. And even through the nostalgia, I still think there's a little bit of merit in it. But at some point, this video has to end much like those games. And that point is now. I need to thank the proofreaders of this script, which is a friend of mine and another friend of mine, one friend who will remain nameless, but the friend who will not remain nameless is Rosenkreutz. If you like this kind of video game-y stuff, Rosenkreutz does that all the time over on their channel. You should go check them out. I mean, you probably already subscribed to them, but I'm just saying, if you like this, they proofread this, and they do this all the time. This is not my bread and butter in the same way as it is his. I also need to thank Molto, who made all of the thumbnails for this, because I decided to try 3 different thumbnails, see how that went. She does fantastic work. There'll be a link to her, Ko-fi and stuff in the description. Please go check her out. She is a fantastic, long-time friend of the channel. I also want to say the obvious obligatory YouTuber thing. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, comment, all the good stuff. Do all the good stuff, everyone. Why won't you do the good stuff? Just do the good stuff. Don't choose the renegade option of watching to this point and pretending like you didn't like the video. I also want to thank the patrons and members. I have to do the plug. If you want the videos early, if you want to vote on the topics of videos, if you want to suggest topics to me, if you want access to the super secret bits of the Discord, the Patreon and YouTube membership are the ways forward there. And I need to thank the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Kersey Scheider, Liron, Jar Jar Muba, and Carolyn. Thank you to them, they are absolute legends. And I need to thank the YouTube members, Nadir Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, and Ben Johnson. Also all absolute legends. Thank you to them, and thank you to you for making it this far. If you like the video, go check out some other ones, I guess, or just have a good day. I don't know, I'm rambling here, so I'm going to bring this one to a close and say, take it easy, everyone. I'll catch you on the next one. See ya!